Greetings, this is Greg. The U.S. Army Air Force had numerous fighter planes during World War II, but only 3 that were really capable of escorting the U.S. heavy bombers and taking on the Luftwaffe at high altitudes. The first of these was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, followed by the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and finally, North American's Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang. Of these 3 airplanes, not surprisingly, the P-38 was the most expensive. The cost alone called into question the wisdom of purchasing the plane once the lower-cost alternatives were proven. A new P-38 in 1944 cost about $97,000. A P-47, which could do about as well or better in certain roles, cost $85,000. A P-51 in 1944 was only $51,000. Compared with the P-38, the P-51 is almost half the price, with far lower operating costs and easier pilot training. Thus, from early 1944 on, just the act of buying P-38s could be seen as somewhat controversial. However, it's more than that. The plane had a number of technical issues which added to the controversy. Add in the fact that during 1944, the 8th Air Force replaced all their P-38s with P-51s, and the plane's reputation took quite a hit. Hal Hibbard, the vice president and chief engineer at Lockheed, referred to the P-38 in this article as one of the most controversial airplanes. Take a look at the date. This was in August of 1944, so he wrote this at a point in time when the P-38s were being rapidly replaced by P-51s. The 8th Air Force Tactical Development Book has a chart which gives you a pretty good idea how quickly the P-51s took over the role from the P-38s in that theater. So all this looks pretty bad for the P-38. It's really expensive, had significant technical issues, something I'll circle back to, and the famous 8th Air Force didn't want them. What's not often remembered is the fact that the Merlin-powered P-51s didn't start operating in significant numbers until early 1944. They didn't outnumber P-38s in the 8th Air Force until April of that year, only 2 months before D-Day. By that point, the course of the war had already been set. Most turning points in the war happened in 1942 and 1943, and for most of those turning points, the P-38 was there. During these years, U.S. commanders were asking for more P-38s. So while everyone seems to remember the 8th Air Force getting rid of them, few seem to remember that for most of the war, U.S. commanders were screaming for more P-38 Lightnings. Let's take a look at the Hap Arnold World War II diaries for some context on this. Here you can see from a discussion in 1942 that General Cheney felt that P-38s shouldn't be used. They're talking about the European theater here. However, this next bit shows that once the P-38s had been proven in combat, they were wanted by Eisenhower in the Mediterranean. At the same time, Hap Arnold wanted to keep them operating out of the United Kingdom. As seen in this snippet, this continued until at least early 1944. Hap Arnold was not only trying to get P-38s for his operation out of the United Kingdom, he was literally trying to get every single P-38 that was built. When we combine that with the fact that we know there were P-38s operating in other theaters, I think it's obvious that the individual theater commanders were all trying hard to get P-38s of their own. And that's supported by other entries. We can see that in the Pacific, P-38s were being requested by multiple commanders. They weren't just asking for more airplanes, but specifically for more P-38 Lightnings. It's important to keep this in mind as we get into the technical problems with the Lightning. Yes, it had some problems, but it's obvious that they were outweighed by the advantages of the plane, which is why the plane was in such high demand. Now let's go back to that Hal Hibbard article for a moment. I think he makes some very valid points about the 38's problems. I'm going to paraphrase this, but I'll put up the actual text on screen for you. Let's zoom in so you can pause and read if desired. Of course, this actual magazine and other documents in this video are in my Patreon section in PDF format. Hibbard is pointing out that because the P-38 was the first fighter to reach 400 miles per hour, and to be capable of high speeds at very high altitudes, it required new technologies and techniques in construction to do it. It's not unusual for new technologies or techniques to run into technical problems, as well as become a target for undue criticism. First on the list of problems is the P-38's high parasite drag. I talked about this in the previous video on the plane, so I'll just gloss over it here. The Lightning has high parasite drag as compared with other U.S. World War II fighters. That's because after the P-38 first flew, NACA came out with a lot of new information that benefited the P-47, the P-51, the Corsair, and even the Hellcat. In the last video, I talk about the drag from the turbo installation, the exposed turbo itself, and the collection of related cooling scoops, which are all over the plane. We also have drag from the wing. Now, the wing was pretty good in terms of induced drag, which will help it at lower indicated airspeeds and in turn radius. But it has a lot of parasite drag, which hurts it at high indicated airspeeds, and that's a big factor at lower altitudes. We also have some very high drag gun ports. This open gun port arrangement was common when the P-38 was designed, but these cause a lot of drag. NACA figured this out, and the drag from gun ports was minimized on future designs. The P-51's gun ports look a lot like what NACA came up with here, and that's not a coincidence. Thus, I suppose, rather than saying that the P-38 has high drag, it makes more sense to say that the other planes have lower drag because they benefited from information that wasn't available at the time the P-38 was designed. Let's break open Quest for Performance from NASA to take a look at some drag numbers. Here you can see that the zero lift coefficient of drag for the P-38 is not only higher than the P-51's, as you would expect, it's even higher than the Hellcats, and by a large margin. The drag area numbers are to the right, and of course the Lightning is the highest there too because it's a darn big airplane. The Lightning has a lot of power to cope with all that drag. That power evens out most speed contests, even down at lower altitudes. It's just that it's not as fast as it would have been otherwise. As an example, and I'm going to use the P-38G, that plane came out in mid-1942. It was heavily used in the Pacific. It's the variant that got Yamamoto. Commonly used airplane in 1942. The P-38G's speed at 5,000 feet, which is a low altitude, is within around 5 miles an hour of most anything else that was flying at the time. It's just that the P-38 was using a lot more power to get that speed because of its drag. To keep things in context, I'll put up a chart I made for a P-38G model versus other 1942 aircraft. Now keep in mind there are later and faster versions of each plane here. I'm trying to put up stuff from mid-1942. At 5,000 feet, all of these planes are pretty close in terms of maximum level flight speeds. They range from 339 to 357 miles per hour. The P-38, in spite of its drag, sits squarely in the middle of this range, and these are all fast airplanes by mid to late 1942 standards. And again, the 38G we're looking at here came out in July of 42. The Corsair doesn't quite fit in, as it didn't enter service until very late 42, the 28th of December, but I thought it would make my point pretty well. At 5,000 feet, due to throttling, its 2,000 horsepower engine only has 1,800 horsepower. So I think this perfectly demonstrates the differences in drag. The P-38 needs 640 more horsepower to reach the same speed as the Corsair. The Mosquito here has the Merlin 21. It is not the later variant with the two-stage Merlin. However, it is representative of a typical Mosquito in 1942. We will get to the dual-stage versions another time. Let's take a look at speeds at 25,000 feet and see what happens. Up at this altitude, parasite drag is less of an issue because the planes will be at relatively low indicated airspeeds for a given true airspeed. Up here, not many planes can outrun a 38 in mid-42, and no Axis fighter could do it. I think that's enough about drag. The takeaway should be that yes, it was high, but the P-38 was still pretty darn fast. Sharp observers probably noticed already that on this chart I show the P-38 with only 1,220 horsepower aside, when the P-38G engines were rated at 1,425 per side. And there's a little bit of variation on those ratings depending on exactly when you're looking at it. But this dovetails into the next problem I want to talk about, and it's a pretty big problem. In that test, they couldn't run more than 1,220 horsepower without running into carburetor air temperature limits. This problem would affect all P-38s that saw combat prior to the introduction of the P-38J in mid-1943. Allow me to explain. Air coming out of the turbochargers is hot. I'll be calling that the charge air. It's hot for two main reasons. First, the turbo compresses the air, and when you compress air, it gets hot. The air also picks up additional heat from the turbocharger itself, as the unit is not 100% efficient. It's a good idea to cool that air back down through the use of an intercooler. Lowering the temperature of the charge air increases its density, and that alone results in more power. Plus, it decreases the tendency for the engine to knock, which in turn allows higher manifold pressure and power for a given fuel octane rating. So, intercooling in a World War II airplane is a pretty important thing. The early P-38s have intercoolers built into the leading edges of the wings outboard of the booms. This design is clever because it eliminates the large external scoops that would normally be associated with an intercooling system, thus reducing drag. I think they use the aircraft skin to cool the charge air. In other words, I think it's a skin-to-air heat exchanger. But I'm not sure of that, and I can't find a single explanation of how the wing intercoolers actually work in any document. But I don't see any external ducting that would support a conventional intercooler, either air-to-air or liquid-to-air. So I'm pretty sure that they use the aircraft skin to cool the charge air. But if anyone knows for sure, please post in the comments, especially if you have a source. The problem in the case of the P-38's intercoolers is that they were designed for the 1,150 horsepower Allison engine. As they increased power, that was done by raising manifold pressure, and that was the pretty normal way in World War II of getting more and more power out of an aircraft engine. And more manifold pressure means more boost from the turbo, which in turn means higher charge air. The wing-mounted intercoolers just couldn't handle it. As they were integrated into the wings, making them bigger wasn't really possible without a major redesign. It wasn't only the extra power that overtaxed the wing intercoolers. When climbing, they had another issue. Now, you might think that as the plane climbs, the intercoolers would have an easier and easier time because the temperature decreases with altitude. However, that decrease in temperature is more than offset by the turbos having to do more and more work to maintain the same manifold pressure because they're starting with thinner air in the first place. Thus, maintaining a low enough carb temperature during a climb and when at high altitude was a problem for the early P-38s. The fact that the original requirements called for operation at 20,000 feet, but the actual needs were to go higher by the time the P-38s entered service, probably didn't help. The pilot's manual for the P-38H and earlier versions, these are the versions with wing intercoolers, say to maintain a carburetor air temperature below 120 Fahrenheit or about 50 degrees centigrade. If the temperatures climb to that level and the pilot wants to maintain altitude or continue climbing, he has no choice but to pull the throttles back. There are no intercooler flaps which can be open more, so other than reducing power or lowering the nose to build up more speed, there's nothing the pilot can do to decrease the temps. This is the reason that most performance testing of the earlier P-38s was done at some power setting below the maximum. They just kept hitting the carb air temperature limits before they could get to the engine's maximum rated power. In short, it seems that Lockheed used internal wing intercoolers, probably for streamlining, but they were only just adequate for 1,150 horsepower engines. When power went up, they really couldn't do the job anymore, especially when above 20,000 feet. The obvious fix was to put in bigger intercoolers, and that's just what they did. In August of 1943, they came out with the P-38J, which had a conventional air-to-air intercooler located down low in the nacelle and towards the rear of the engine. It's sort of like a mini P-47 intercooling system on each side. This picture shows the wing intercooler located at position 9 in the case of the wing-mounted units in the older models, and at position 20 for the P-38J and later models. This new intercooler configuration worked quite well. It may have reduced the streamlining of the nacelles a bit, but the extra power more than made up for it. The P-38J could run at 60 inches of manifold pressure, giving it over 1,600 horsepower per side, and it could make that power all the way up to very high altitudes. In the event that carb temps did creep up to the limits, the pilot could open the intercooler shutters for even more cooling. Once the 38Js came out in August of 43, the carb air temperature limits were no longer a problem holding back the new P-38s. To get an idea just how effective the new intercoolers were, let's take a look at the engine performance for a P-38H, which is the version with the older wing intercoolers but the newer turbochargers as used in the later J model. This is about as apples to apples as we can get for a comparison of intercoolers. I want you to notice that this is an H model with a V1710-89 on the right and a -91 on the left. That's because of the different rotation. We have 130 octane fuel, and the engines can put out 1,600 horsepower, up to 10,000 feet at war emergency power. The same engines in the P-38J, same turbos, can maintain 1,600 horsepower, so the same amount of power, but up to 28,700 feet. That's a lot more than 10,000 feet, and the only difference here is the intercooler. Now this dovetails into another early problem P-38s had, and by that I mean the F and G models. They didn't have enough turbocharger. Take a look at the data for the G model. Its turbocharger can provide enough air to reach 1,425 horsepower per engine at an altitude up to 15,000 feet. At 24,000 feet, it's down to 1,100, and at 30,000 feet, 740. That was fine in the Pacific, where most of the fighting took place below 15,000, but it really wasn't going to cut it over Fortress Europe up at 25,000. In order to be competitive with the Luftwaffe and escort the U.S. heavy bombers over Fortress Europe, the P-38 was going to need more power at high altitudes. So starting in May of 1943, with the introduction of the H model, or possibly sometime during the H model's production run, they switched to a newer, better turbo, and the H model could maintain 1,425 horsepower up to 24,800 feet, so that's a lot better. But of course, it could only do that if the carb air temp stayed low enough, which they usually didn't. Thus, the H models were a relatively ineffective stopgap airplane between the Gs and the Js, and they were pretty quickly replaced by the J models with their much better intercoolers. The J models had those intercoolers, we'll call them chin intercoolers, I guess, and they were a huge improvement. It could maintain 1,425 horsepower up to 29,000 feet, and more importantly, it could really do it in the real world. All these earlier models would typically run into carb temp issues, and that would prevent them from reaching their maximum rated power levels, as seen repeatedly in test data. The J model was the first one to have both enough turbocharger and enough intercooler to actually use the power. This is part of the reason that with the 8th Air Force over Europe, the P-38 didn't enjoy the same level of success it did in the Pacific and the Mediterranean. There was no fighter version of the P-38 they could really use until the J model, and that didn't come out until August of 1943. The 8th didn't get them until January of 44. That was bad timing because at that point the Merlin-powered P-51 was about to come on the scene, and it could do the same job in terms of escorting. That's what I'm talking about in this at the moment. It could do the same job in terms of escorting for a far lower price. So far we've covered 4 problems with the P-38. All of them were pretty serious. It was really expensive, had high drag relative to the later U.S. fighters. It didn't have enough turbocharger, and it didn't have enough intercooler. The problem of expense was never solved. The turbocharger issue was solved, starting with the H model via the newer, better turbo, and that turbo was really able to shine when the intercooling problem was solved with the introduction of the J model. The high drag probably got worse with the J model, but it had enough power to make up for it. The Js were faster than any previous version, and they had a usable 1600 horsepower per engine versus power as low as 1150 in some of the earlier models. That brings us to the next problem. When you add that much power, you're likely to need a new propeller design. They had increased power almost 40%, but hadn't added a new propeller. For comparison, when the P-47 went from 2,000 to 2,300 horsepower, they added the new paddle-bladed props, which were a big key in taking full advantage of that extra 300 horsepower. The P-38 had a much larger gain in power, but no new propellers. Of course, there was a fix for that, which was to install new Hamilton Standard hydraulic paddle props. These were tested on modified P-38s and intended for a plane that was to be called the P-38K, but only 2 were ever built. They bumped up power even more than 1,600, all the way up to 1,875 horsepower per side. And with the new paddle props and 1,875 horsepower per side, the P-38K could outperform any other U.S. fighter in terms of climb and speed at the time. The powers that be decided not to put the P-38K into production. So the P-38 soldiered on through the entire war without the benefit of paddle props as used on the Thunderbolt and similar to what was used on the Mustang, and thus it never really had the performance its 1,600 horsepower engines could have given it, let alone 1,875 horsepower engines, and there was testing done at 2,000 horsepower, but that would have been pointless without changing out the props. So it's just a point of interest there. The P-38 never really got the propellers it needed to exploit even at 1,600 horsepower, let alone the power capabilities of the Allison beyond that. One of the most famous problems of the P-38 was its relatively poor dive performance. The P-38 had a maximum dive speed of 420 miles per hour indicated, according to the pilot's manual, and Mach limit of 0.68. It's the Mach limit that's the real problem here, although that 420 mile per hour indicated speed is not great, but the Mach limit is the bigger issue, as that's going to be a big factor at high altitude where you'll reach the Mach limit at relatively low indicated airspeeds. When the plane reaches its Mach limit, it encounters compressibility and becomes uncontrollable. It's possible to recover the plane from this if there's enough altitude, but it's very risky to get into compressibility in the first place. This is one of the problems that really wasn't Lockheed's fault. The P-38 was the first fighter to fly fast enough and high enough to encounter this issue. It affected all World War II fighters with similar performance to one degree or another. Lockheed's P-38 design team just happened to be the first people to run into this, and they lost some test aircraft and pilots because of it. They couldn't avoid the problem in the first place because they didn't know it existed. Subsequent designs like the P-47 and P-51 had improvements and higher Mach numbers, typically around 0.80. This didn't matter too much in the Pacific for 2 main reasons. First of all, the Japanese planes didn't have stellar dive performance either, so the 38 could still outdive most of them. Additionally, operations in the Pacific tended to be at lower altitudes, where Mach limitations were not a factor as often because the plane would usually reach its red line of 420 miles per hour on the airspeed indicator, thus its structural limit, before it would reach its Mach limit. But over in Germany, at high altitude, totally different situation. When escorting at high altitude, the planes are operating pretty close to their Mach limits and are much more likely to get into compressibility if they dive. There's another factor here that's almost never mentioned and isn't well understood, and that is that the speed of sound varies with temperature, not specifically with altitude. There's confusion about that, but aerodynamics for naval aviators is very clear about this. The speed of sound varies with temperature. Now, it's much warmer in the Pacific. which increases the altitude at which the plane's Mach limit becomes a factor. So let me put all this into perspective for you. In the standard atmosphere, the P-38 will always encounter its airspeed limit, thus its structural limit, before its Mach limit when below 12,000 feet. Thus, at an altitude at or below 12,000, as long as the pilot doesn't go above 420 miles per hour on the indicator, he will be fine. However, above 12,000 feet, the plane will encounter its Mach limit below the red line of 420, so he must use extra caution and adhere to the speeds shown on this chart. Looking at this chart, we can see that up at 30,000 feet, 280 miles per hour indicated gives us 440 true. Since the speed of sound is relatively low up there, that puts the true airspeed pretty close to the plane's Mach limit of 0.68. And of course, over the Pacific, you would encounter these Mach limits at higher altitudes than standard. The chart is shown in the standard atmosphere. And over Germany in the winter of 1943, you're going to encounter these at lower altitudes. So this is a really significant difference between the European and Pacific theaters. Thus, in the Pacific, where most of the action took place at lower altitudes, the P-38's Mach limit just didn't come into play nearly as often as it did over Germany on escort missions. This was further complicated by the fact that the mission of the U.S. Army Air Force in Europe was not to bomb German industry into oblivion, as most people think. That was a secondary goal. The primary goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe so that it couldn't oppose the D-Day landings. I have incontestable evidence of this in my P-47 Part 8 video, so I'm not going to go over it all here again, but that video is up if you want to watch it. In order to destroy the Luftwaffe, they of course had to shoot down planes and kill pilots. That would be hard to do if the Germans could simply disengage by diving away, which they could when fighting P-38s. Both the 109s and 190s had Mach limits of 0.75 or better. The 38 just couldn't follow them down in a steep dive from 25,000 feet. This was well understood by General Doolittle and others, so the P-38s were really not well suited for the 8th Air Force's needs in 1944, and the clock was ticking. D-Day was coming, and the P-38, while a capable airplane, wasn't really the right plane for the job, that is, the job of escorting high-altitude bombers over Europe. And the dive limitation was probably the single biggest part of this, although there are some other things that are pretty big. Now, not to be deterred, Lockheed came up with what I'll call a partial solution to this problem. These are the dive flaps. When at or above the Mach limit, compressibility causes two big problems. First, it tends to lock up the controls. They become immovable. Second, the center of pressure on the wing moves aft, causing the plane to pitch down. So we need to pitch up and slow down. The dive flaps solve both of these problems. They help the plane pitch up, which by itself also helps slow down, and they add a lot of drag, which slows the plane down as well. The dive flaps were a great addition to the P-38, however they didn't show up until the J model, specifically the J-25 and later airplanes. Lockheed made kits to retrofit the older models already in Europe and packed them into a C-54 and sent them on their way. The British shot down that C-54, thus most P-38s in Europe never got the dive flaps, and by the time they could have, the decision to replace them had already been made. And as I said earlier, the dive flaps were really a partial solution anyway. It does make the plane recoverable and gives pilots more confidence in pushing up against the Mach limit, but the FW-190s and 109s would have still been able to dive away from the P-38, so this wasn't a total solution. Now, those are all the P-38 issues I'm going to cover for now, but there are quite a few more that I'll talk about in the next P-38 video, and some of those are pretty darn big. In summary, we talked about drag, inadequate turbos, inadequate intercoolers, and a low Mach limit. The P-38's drag was about as good as it could have been for a plane its size designed in 1937. It's only high relative to the later U.S. fighters because they benefited from later information from NACA. The P-38 was built with flush riveting and butt-jointed panels and had a very streamlined cowling setup. Of course, it lost those streamlined cowlings later when the chin intercoolers were installed. The turbo and intercooler issues sort of go together. As designed, the plane was fine. It could easily exceed the original design requirements. However, when pushing the power up to 1,400 horsepower, or even much beyond the original 1150, the intercoolers just weren't up to the task. Likewise, the turbos were fine in terms of meeting the original requirements and climbing rapidly to 20,000 feet, but they just didn't have enough for the power requirements at 25,000. It's easy to blame Lockheed for a lack of foresight on this one, but we have to consider some things. Turbochargers were still in their infancy. This was Lockheed's first military airplane, and it was designed at a time when military aviation and turbochargers and engines were all changing rapidly. Looking at military aviation in 1937, it would have been hard to foresee what it looked like in 1944. I think Lockheed did a decent job here with the knowledge they had at the time, but they didn't foresee the improvements in fuels and turbochargers, so when more power became available, the 38 didn't have the intercoolers needed to take full advantage of it. They corrected that with the J model, but it was just a little too late for the European theater. The low Mach limit / compressibility issue really wasn't Lockheed's fault. The P-38 was the first fighter with enough speed and altitude capability to regularly encounter this issue. Thus, it was partially hamstrung by a problem nobody in the world knew existed at the time the plane was designed. Later designs, like the P-51, benefited from knowledge gained, in a large part due to the pioneering of the P-38's design team. The single biggest problem with the P-38 is also the one that I think is least frequently mentioned, and that's the cost. As technology marched on, it became possible to have a plane with the same or better performance for a lot less money, both in terms of purchase price and operating cost. Both the P-47 and P-51 Mustang are essentially just as good as fighter planes and as escort aircraft, and in the case of the 47, just as good for ground attack. However, both of them, and especially the 51, do it for a lot less money, which of course means you can have more of them. That makes sense though. Time marches on, and with it we have progress, usually. In a sense, the P-38 was a victim of bad timing. Had Japan and Germany declared war on the U.S. in 1939 instead of late 1941, the P-38s would have been seen in a very different light than it is today. Even so, all of these problems and the others I'll be talking about in the next video were more than compensated for by the plane's attributes, at least up until early 1944, and by that point the course of the war was pretty much set, so the 38s had done their job. That's all for now. I do have the Hal Hibbard full article up in the Patreon section. In fact, I have the entire magazine there in PDF form for all Patreon members. For captain level members, I put up about 10 color aviation magazines from 1944 in the same high-res format. I'd like to thank all my subscribers. I'm really stunned and honored that this channel just broke 80,000 subscribers. I never expected to get to even 800. I know that the biggest YouTube channels that cover these topics do things a completely different way. They generally put up stock video footage, add some mood music, and more or less just read facts from Wikipedia. They keep the video around 12 minutes because that optimizes the ad revenue you can get from YouTube. Making a 30-minute video is not the best plan in terms of ad revenue, but my Patreon supporters help make up for that. Now, it's clear that that other formula works, as those channels get 10 times the views I do, but I'm trying to do something different here, and so I appreciate every one of you, every one of the 80,000 who usually watch. I do try to answer all the questions in the comments, but sometimes it's impossible, usually shortly after a new video release. But I do try. Anyhow, bye for now, and I hope you have a great day.